welcome you all. Thank you so much for joining us. And it's a very special afternoon because we have Professor Ed Witkowski from Wits University presenting today. But I'm going to hand over to Anina to introduce him formally. But thanks again for joining us this afternoon. Right. Ed, you're now in the chair.
Thank you very much, Glynis. Yes, welcome everybody to our second webinar this year. We're very excited to have Prof. Witkowski here. Just a quick short introduction. His contribution to botany has been fantastic. His research has covered various biomes and ecosystems, and he studied many endangered plants and invasive species control and restoration, among other topics. His insights and his interventions have helped to save rare species from extinction, and his work has also contributed to sustainable utilization of economically and medicinally important plant species. He's also contributed to growing the new generation of botanists through his supervision of postgraduate students, including 67 master students, 29 PhD students, and hosting of 4 postdoctoral research fellows. And his research outputs also testify of his contribution to this field, with over 200 publications and over 5,000 citations, as well as 8 book chapters and contributing to 26 technical reports. And all of this has been very valuable to the field of botany and conservation and many other fields as well. So we're really looking forward to hearing this talk. Just quick things before we start with that. While the webinar is going on, we would appreciate it if everybody would just have their cameras off and microphones muted. You're welcome to ask questions at the end, so you can write your questions in the chat box during the webinar if you want, and then we will attend to that at the end, or you can keep your questions and you can ask them yourself at the end as well. And yeah, I think that's all. If you want SACNAS points for this attending this webinar, please just send your name in the chat box, please. Is there anything that I missed? I think
just to say that Ed was our silver medalist this year. So
yes, sorry. Right. Okay, I think that is it. Thank you very much, Ed. We look forward to it.
Right, thanks very much, Glynis, and thanks very much, Anina, for that introduction. And yeah, I know it's a pleasure to once again present to SAAB. I've always sent the students to SAAB, but I haven't attended for a while myself, and you know, and it's great to say good day to colleagues and friends and students. So I've been working on threatened plant species in the northern parts of South Africa for quite a while, and this presentation hopefully will give you a taste of what I've been up to for quite a long while. Hang on a minute. Here we go. Now, I did send through the abstract, so quickly read it. Right, moving on. At Wits, we're very big on biodiversity, and we have an annual event to encourage students and school kids and so on. And we even formed our own biodiversity research trust, which at one point was a big deal at Wits. And for a long while, I was the so-called champion. And although I definitely don't look like Muhammad Ali, I was the champion nonetheless, but I looked like this fellow on the computer here, scurrying away, trying to analyze data. Biodiversity, our living natural heritage. And all of you know, South Africa has this rich, unique, relatively unspoilt fauna and flora. under threat from development and perhaps poor management. So on 1% of global land surface, we have 10% of the world's birds and freshwater fish, about 6% of the world's plants, mammals, and reptiles. Some regions, of course, exceptionally rich in species, biodiversity hotspots, fynbos, succulent karoo, those are the biomes that are exceptionally rich, and there's other sites that are rich. High concentration of threatened plant species, as shown in the Red Book of 2009. Richness of species and ecosystems points to the importance of systematic conservation planning to help to conserve all these different types of systems. But even with good planning, single species conservation approach is still necessary, otherwise many species will just fall through the cracks and disappear. That's my motivation. So what's the aim of this presentation? Well, I'll show you some nice looking slides. And in a way, it's steps on a journey of discovery, perhaps. It's about what I've been doing for a long time, and conservation was always in mind. So just for a bit of background, I did a master's at WITS on the ecology of Glacieri Reserve. It's a big 5 reserve next to Kruger. And that was an exciting time. Then I did a PhD at UCT, looking at nutrient additions on fynbos. And then I did a postdoc during the PhD looking at invasive alien acacias and nutrient cycling in the fynbos. And then Richard Cowling took me on for about a year with a postdoc, and we were doing various things with leucodendrons and proteas. So much conservation in South Africa in the 60s, 70s, and 80s focused on large mammals, and many higher taxon groups virtually ignored in many protected areas, particularly plants. Then I did a postdoc in Australia where we looked at the ecology, ecophysiology, conservation of banksias. There's me and my postdoc mentor, Byron Lamont. Actually, this photo was taken quite a few years after the postdoc was over, but anyway, it's an interesting one. We worked on banksias, which included the conservation of these. Banksia hookeriana was it's got a very beautiful bloom, and it's been picked for the wildflower trade, so we looked into that. But what I'm going to tell you a little bit more about is this other species, Banksia goodii, which is a prostrate Banksia. And this is an example of Banksia goodii. Here's the inflorescences, and here's a cone. This is a fertile cone. You can see these follicles, which means it produces seeds. This was quite an important study for me, and may have been one of the studies that influenced me a lot going into the future. So just to show you some of the data collected, Banksia goodii plant fertility in relation to population size. Now these plants are serotinous, canopy seed storage. So you can see this year's cones, last year's cones that produce seeds, and you can go back a few years. And we can see how number of seeds in a population increases with population size. Nothing particularly remarkable about that. It's a nice graph. It's on a log scale. And then number of seeds per unit population size, also get these increases, but it's curvilinear. So when you have very small population sizes in terms of areas, you're not getting a lot of seeds produced at all. And perhaps this graph here is the key point I'm going to make here. So this is the number of seeds produced on a plant and the population area. And these populations here, which are quite small in area, and actually represent very few plants, probably less than 10 in a population, producing no seeds at all. They're infertile. And you get a threshold size, and then as the population numbers and area increases, they become increasingly more fertile. You're getting more seeds per plant. So this is quite an important thing. And here is one of the plants where this is a population, supposed population on a road verge. There's a road over there, where there's only a single plant. And it was a big plant and it was healthy and it had lots of cones. Going back a few years, there were no seeds produced at all because there's no follicles produced. You can really see it very clearly. So it's sterile. This is the population market that they put up for these sorts of populations. They do quite a good job of that in Australia. So I think this was a precursor to future activities or studies, and perhaps the first published paper on the alley effect in plants. So anyway, we got up to mischief sometimes. On our last field trip in 1991, seedlings from seeds collected from the largest, most fertile population. We grew the seedlings in Perth, and we planted them out along this road verge next to that plant I just showed you, on either side of the plant, me and the students. So we're very enthusiastic undergrads. It was a very satisfying experience, and that was the end of that story, I thought. And then a couple of years later, I was here in Joburg. Byron then was informed by Conservation and Land Management that there were many more plants on that road verge. And they were excited, and he had to explain what we did, that we planted them. And they weren't too happy at first, but anyway, it was a single plant. It's a dead duck unless you add more plants. It's not going anywhere. Anyhow, this was a small precursor to what you will hear later with our Protea study. So when I started at WITS in '93, I thought I want to repeat this type of experience, and I thought it was important to work with the conservation authorities who would help with applying any useful results we obtained. So I got hold of what was in the Nature Conservation Division of the Transvaal Provincial Administration, and the key person was Wayne Boyd, this fellow here. He was really helpful. So we went on a road trip and we traveled the northern provinces, but in those days it was just the Transvaal, and we looked at various threatened plant species. They had been monitoring many species, and so he could show me the ones that he felt were important to look at. And of course, just later that year, we had a new government, new provinces, new conservation authorities. Change was happening. Many opportunities for changes in the conservation establishment. So, and a lot of good things happened around that time. Anyhow, I'm going to give you an outline of the talk. So mostly we're dealing with this bottom-up approach, single species, small spatial scale studies. What do they entail? Well, I'll give you some example studies. We looked at lots of euphorbias, delospermas. Then originally I was going to give you a talk called A Protea Story about Protea repelli hamiltonia in the Dr. Hamilton Protea, the Dr. Hamilton, sorry, the Protea's in the wrong place, reserve. And then later on, aloes, protected trees. We also did a more top-down approach happening at the same time, looking at medicinal plants, conservation within and beyond nature reserves, biosphere reserves, and not a lot, but a bit into conservation planning and bioregional programs. Anyway, later on, I'll give you a few thoughts. So I wrote this little paper for a conference on conservation outside nature reserves. And it was kind of our protocol to look at rare and endangered species. By that stage, we'd looked at about 3 species. So we did 4 main things, more or less, for all these studies. Assess all populations for number of plants, size and stage structure, condition, etc. Assess the habitat profile. We looked at the environment, you know, the slopes, the temperatures, the rainfall patterns, the sizes of populations. We looked at threatening processes, and then we looked at reproductive potential and life history traits. You know, and we did this to greater or lesser extents for different species, depending on what we thought was important or we were able to do, because some of these studies were honors projects, others were master's projects, etc. So each species represents a new challenge in terms of the actual methods and threats used to assess these things. So they made excellent student projects. And I kind of feel that we need more studies like this. I would certainly encourage other colleagues to do similar sorts of studies. So yeah, I got busy with numerous studies. We started off with a Haworthia. It was vulnerable, it was super cryptic. When we got to the first site, we had to climb a rocky ridge. We got to the top. We searched around for ages. We couldn't see anything. And then finally we got our eyes in and we started seeing these things. They're so cryptic. And then we saw more and more and more. It's amazing. You don't see things at first. Your eyes get accustomed and then you start seeing them. So this was a master's project. One of our students, Ross Liston. And I'm not going to say a lot. At the time, we felt the plants were secure. As long as these areas are well managed, they should be fine. Then we went and looked at a Cnophophia species, critically endangered. This was actually in Swaziland, nearby at Malalocha. And it was also, this was actually an honours project, but we had a really good student who did a great job. It was impacted at the time, a few years earlier, by a new dam. And they did this sort of thing. They transplanted 4,000 plants from the dam area. Unfortunately, they didn't put them in the same type of habitat. And these died out. We found a few of them in the Malalocha Reserve, but they're not reproducing. So they're like adults that are going nowhere. But anyway, there are lots of other populations, smaller ones, fortunately. And we assessed those, and it's definitely indicated that heavy livestock grazing was impacting a lot on these Cnophophis. I should say one more thing, that we've got a student at SAAB who is going to be looking at a whole lot of endangered euphorbias, or he's already underway. I'm not sure if he's listening in. Then we had another student. She worked at the Nelspruit Botanical Gardens. I suppose it's changed its name, I can't remember. On Adenium swazicum, also critically endangered. Quite a nice species to work on. And she was doing quite a lot of trying to plant them out in the gardens as well, and exploring different ways of watering them, and how to plant them in such a way that they would survive, whether they needed shade or not. She did a whole lot of trials like that. The tubers of this plant are used medicinally. In horticulture, of course, there's hybridization with Adenium obesum. This is the one we're familiar with, the Sabi star, or the impala lily is the common name. And swazicum also occurs in South Africa. The plants that we found outside the Kruger National Park are impacted by medicinal harvesters, and then also outside Kruger Park, habitat destruction, because the habitat's really very suitable for sugarcane, which was increasing over time. So here's a few more pictures of it in flower. Corinne found that they were pollinated by hawk moths at night. Here are the pods, and here are some pictures of the pods releasing the seeds, and you can see they're going to blow away in the wind. We had a big concentration on succulent species, and of course, this was a very important reference here by Gideon Smith et al. Southern Africa has 46% of global succulent flora. That was really something that was so interesting to read about. And of course, succulents are popular in horticulture, and many species are threatened by collectors, especially small succulent aloes and Haworthias and euphorbias. There's a big problem here. Some used medicinally. Large numbers of threatened species are succulent. Prioritization is essential. So many groups that we looked at: aloes, euphorbias, delospermas. They're in the Mesembrya infamacea. So we had a good student. Her name was Dalit Maron. She also did a master's on these delosperma. 6 species she looked at. 5 of them, at the time, 3 of them we knew they were endangered or critically endangered. 2 were data deficient, and 1 was a common species, which is useful for comparison. And the aim was to better understand population ecology, biology, and threats of listed delosperma species, to and to the development of conservation management plans, we really knew very little. Michelle Fabb was the co-supervisor, and of course at the time she was working for the Gauteng government, and a lot of these plants were on the ridges, and she was trying to prevent further development on ridges because there was quite a lot of valuable species that would get taken out if they were developed. It's nice to compare lots of species because then you can see trends and so on. So these are different species: Delosperma macellum, purpureum. So the one was originally critically endangered, the other one endangered. Then Gautengensis, endangered. Leondertzii, data deficient, Leondertzii, data deficient. Really knew very little about it. And so that was important to include that one. Davii, also data deficient. And then Herbium was the common one. So we looked at population parameters. Here's all the different species here. These are different land uses. A lot of them were in urban areas. Areas of some populations like this one, the Leondertzii, very small area, very few plants aggregated together. There's very little here. Other species, quite nice big populations, but it's very variable. We looked at the dispersion pattern and lots of other variables, but these population sizes vary from very tiny, still quite small. You get some biggish ones, but they're not that big, and there's not that many populations that we know of. And maybe more will be found, and these are in Gauteng, and maybe more will be found in Northwest. Then we looked at reproduction. It's quite an easy one to work with reproduction. So population size was a good indicator of seed production, and they produce masses of seeds, tiny little seeds. So we could harvest the capsules, we could count the seeds per capsule, and you multiply those two together and you get seeds per plant. So you can imagine some of these have got masses, very high seed production. So the seeds are tiny, germination is very high, over 90%, easy to germinate, can produce seeds without cross-pollination, canopy seed storage in these capsules, actually, transient soil seed banks, so they don't stay long in the soil, they've got to germinate or die, and rain or wind dispersed seeds. And let's see, here's just a graph of the seed mass. It varies a bit amongst the species, but they're really tiny, very seeds that are produced. We did growth trials as well, and there's high rates of growth, high shoot to root ratios, and succulents don't need big root systems because of the nature of succulent leaves. Rapid attainment of reproductive maturity. In fact, I was quite surprised. Many of these traits are associated with what we think of as weeds. So they're quite easy to work with. Seed production increases with plant size. Here's some of our little trials. So you can see them growing like mad here. We looked at their root growth. These are root observation chambers. We did all sorts of things. Well, de Ligt was very energetic and doing lots of things. And then we reassess the threat levels. This might be out of date now. So the first two, I think, remained the same, but then these ones that were data deficient went from data deficient to endangered, Leondertzii to critically endangered. Obviously, there's very few plants, and then Davii are also endangered. Extinction risk due to urbanization, reduced population sizes, and small numbers of subpopulations per species. And de Ligt also took the plants and what she had, seeds and so on, for an ex situ conservation effort at the Walter Sisulu National Botanical Gardens. We worked with Andrew Hankey, and I got an email to him recently, and he gave me an updated report. And these plants, we were worried initially about hybridization, but they have not hybridized after several years, initially with pollination covers for many years. So that seems to be quite a success story all round. We looked at a number of succulent euphorbias, and many of these are threatened. And there was a study that I wasn't really involved with by Peter Ryle. I knew him, he was a Wits student, and in a way, this was a great example study back in the 80s that our students all looked at the time. There was even a student looking at Frinovolgi at Limpopo University as well. He completed his MSc. But really, my first student after the road trip was Laura Knowles, and we looked at Euphorbia barnardia, and we published a paper on it. And I'll give you a few details. And then Michelle Fab also did an MSc and on Euphorbia clivicola, critically endangered. And she did a great job as well and published quite a few papers. The last one was this simple population viability model that we developed. For the Euphorbia barnardia, it occurs in Sepikuni land and unusual, these norite copies, it's an unusual geology. There's lots of mining going on in the area nowadays. There were 5 populations, and this was actually an honors project, but it was excellent. When I published this in Osteoecology, the editor was convinced it was like a master's or a PhD study. Anyway, here's just a picture of the plant. This is the sort of arid landscape it occurs in. The TPA used to do some monitoring of plots. They set up plots of 2 populations, population 2 and population 4. Population 2 over the years, the adult survival was pretty stable, but in the other population, population 4, adult survival went down, 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 down. And given the major decline in population 4, is this monitoring to extinction? This became a theme because often we would see monitoring data and nobody's doing anything to try to arrest the decline. And maybe it's not so easy, but it was something that really struck us at the time. What we found was that these plots were placed on the lower slopes. They're easy to get to. You don't have to climb these hills. We climbed the hills. Some of them are go quite high. And so it was on the lower slope. Often there's a lot of cattle grazing and trampling, and the plants were declining in the plots. But we found that further up that slope, there were lots of plants. So it wasn't as bad as it looked. So we could explain those declines. This is the sort of terrain, and this is these plants are impacted quite a lot. This was the one population where the cattle trampling really impacted a lot. And you can see there's a lot of bare ground here. Further up, things looked a lot better, but we could find a lot of very damaged euphobias at the time. Plants close to human settlements were the most threatened. Euphorbia clivicola, Michelle Fab studied this one, and this is a very healthy looking plant, lots of flowers, it's big. 2 populations in Limpopo province. There was a reserve population, and the numbers had declined by 91%. And this was really monitoring to extinction in this reserve, unfortunately. So we undertook a population viability analysis. We got a lot of information from the other population, which was not in a reserve, but that population was doing quite well. And then based on fire regime, control of herbivores, and population augmentation was the basis of our PVA. Repeat field survey 3 years later to verify the PVA, and the PVA predicted that if we fence to have herbivore exclusion and increase the fire frequency, would result in increased population size, and recommended this to the reserve management. And the model predicts that no change in management will result in local extinction in less than 20 years. There was inaction. The reserve was more interested in large herbivores and not really in plants. This is our simple population model. Don't try to read all the stuff. There's not a lot of inputs. You run this. We do a master's course on this at Wits, and Michelle did that course, and this worked out. This model was quite a neat model, but actually its prediction was correct. The fence was needed to prevent extreme herbivory in the reserve, which you can see here. Mammals eating euphorbias, and there's lots of examples of it. So there's low fire frequency. Turn that off. Apparently good for rare sesame, but results in very moribund grass. So it's poor forage for other herbivores. But the fire regime is completely unsuitable for the euphorbia, which grows vigorously with more frequent fires, as I said in the other population. Fortunately, Michelle has more recently reported a third population has been discovered. Oops. And we've had a couple of recent more euphorbia studies. Our new student who's already graduated, Nkukanya Mshlangu, she's got her master's, and we looked at a couple of KZN and Eastern Cape euphorbias. Umphaloziensis, we think, is extinct in the wild already. Buplerifolia was our common comparison species, and it's becoming uncommon at a rapid rate, with populations disappearing due to illegal harvesting of small succulent plants from the wild, and trade, local and international, has been problematic for many years. And it's also an indigenous medicinal plant as well. We're working on papers. There's a recent Felton Flora article. So euphorbias show different trends in population numbers and threats, and populations within a species often show very different trends related to habitat and management. Mammalian herbaria cause a decline in the Euphorbia perangusta that Peter Rahl studied, and in Clavicola as well. And is herbivory and perhaps disease a threat due to changing interaction with human-modified ecosystems, change fire regimes, or also a manifestation of global change? Difficult questions to answer. Now, this was the original talk I was going to give, would be a Protea story, and this is about the research we did with on Protea rupelli subspecies Hamiltonia. And we looked at in situ and ex situ conservation, only really has one remaining population. This proposal that we wrote also was a bit of a summary of what we knew. So it was quite an important document in its own right. Here's a Hamilton Reserve. Just note this sign. Nothing much growing around it, hey? We didn't, you'll see in at a later picture how things have changed. So this was after we had been working in the reserve for quite a while, all these pretty looking proteas. So the reserve was established to protect this species. It's a low-growing prostrate species, a bit like the Banksia goodyear. And then we also compared the rupelli Hamiltonia with the tree form rupelli. Very restricted distribution. I said one natural population remains, prime pine going region. And here, our colleague Richard Green from DWAF had been working on this plant for years. And there was about 1,000 plants, and then through various monitoring efforts, they declined and declined and declined. I guess our line doesn't fit the data particularly well, but the message is clear. And our road trip was around this time. When I saw these plants, I thought, oh, I don't want to work on this species. This will be a species that looks very difficult to rescue, and rather avoid it. But anyway, this is the story. In 2000, it was getting less and less all the time. We just thought, what's going to happen? When we started working on this thing, I thought the plan we need to do is to rescue this population and get it right back up to 1,000 plants. That's really the only way. I'm going to explain why. It's surrounded by pines. It's a small little reserve. Pines has changed the hydrology, and there's roads and tracks in the reserve that is in size. The reserve must have changed the water movement. We presume this soil acidification from pines. Lots of pine seedlings, huge numbers. I spend a lot of time in the field just yanking them out by hand. And there are also many other invasive alien plant species on the edges of the plantations. And there are fire protection, fire management issues are actually something that we really have still not come to grips with. So what we did, once we got funding, we erected an antelope-proof fence around the remaining plants. And we also looked at ex situ conservation. Our main plan was, if we could, to augment the population to arrest decline with either cuttings, or if we could encourage these plants to flower. You wanted to look at germination requirements and also develop a long-term plan. Now, this is what the plants looked like when we had our road trip in 1994. Absolutely terrible. Proteas were in dire straits. They were being chomped, and they just were in a very bad way. They were caught in a mammalian herbivory trap. Common duiker were eating them. They were shrinking in size. They were very small at this stage. Annual mortality was high. Reproduction had ceased. There was no flowering or growing. They didn't have the oomph to reproduce. Plants were small. It was really, they were looked in dire straits. It really, it's a sort of, as soon as you look at it, it just did not look at all like Banksia goodyear, and it looked like it was on its last legs. So we fenced off, as I said, 7 hectares to prevent herbivory, and over the next 2 to 3 years, the plants grew slowly recovered. Some took a long time to get out of this sort of almost growth pattern, herbivory growth pattern. And then slowly they improved, but still adult mortality good, so they got down to 140 plants. But then the first seeds were produced when they were found to be germinable. Isabel tested them and said, well, they're viable. So we got an honor student involved who tested them on a larger scale, Alex Chipionko, and they were germinating quite nicely. And then, of course, here the following map is from Mervyn Lotter. Here's the reserve, pines all the way around. Here's the fenced area. Here's a little map of where the proteas are. Thank you, Mervyn. This is a 1936 aerial photo before plantation forestry of pines. Here's where the proteas grow. They grow in these areas with very low grass biomass. It's sort of like quite sparse population cover. This is the areas that they favor. You know, it's these sort of areas that shouldn't really carry a very hot fire due to the low biomass, but this is 1936, and at this stage there's no pines anyway. So anyway, we got to work, and by 2006, most of the adult plants were flowering and producing seeds. Hence, large-scale seed germination and seedling growth trials commenced. Steve Tarleton was an excellent MSc student who worked on the proteas, looking at various aspects, and Dave Mycock was the main supervisor, and in the lab, and they looked at tissue culture and all sorts of things. But the deal I had with Steve is that all plants that germinate, all seeds that germinate, we grow them up, and then we're going to plant them back in the site. So we had our first trip back to the site with 282 proteus seedlings. We planted them in dry soil. We were a little bit early. October was a bit early. So we had to water them. As I was pulling out the pine seedlings, I would put them over the proteus seedlings to act as parasols. That helped. Anyway, we had excellent survival. By the following November, the following year, there was still 96% survival of this first lot, which is exceptional, I thought. And so they got right through the cold winter. Those seedlings were in very good shape. Then we really got into our stride. We changed from October to November when it's wet. We planted over 1,000 seedlings in the rain in wet soil, so it was much easier to dig in. And we had an excellent team, Steve, Anisha Daram, Emily Botts, and myself. And we needed endurance because the conditions were tough. And then we carried on planting small numbers. Then we looked at cryopreservation, which Steve did. Dave Mycock is an expert in this field. And we banked some of the seeds in the Millennium Seed Bank. We planted some more seedlings in the Forester's Garden. We gave some to Corinne at the Nell Slate Botanical Garden. We did try a few at Wits, but they really didn't work. We wanted to expand. Donald helped us, but they didn't do well because I think the gardener at Wits dug them up. Then we also gave some to the Walter Sisulu Botanical Gardens, to our colleague Andrew Hankey. I wanted to establish a new wild population, but the other remaining population, which they had created a nature reserve for previously, all those plants had died out, and then they decided to plant pine trees there. Otherwise, I would have planted proteas there. Anyway, John Rourke had taken seeds to Cape Town and planted some at Kirstenbosch. And Anisha, when she was doing her internship, found 3 seedlings. Here's one, look at this. It's a tiny little plant, a few leaves, and there's a cone. Unfortunately, these 3 plants died out. So it's the management of this protea reserve is quite difficult, the fire protection or not protection. But over the years, it got more woody, sort of like bush encroachment, but it's these shrubby bushes. Then we had problems with rodents, returned, started chewing the bark. We had some issues. We set some traps. We caught some striped mouse and we released them far away. Then there was a small fire in a small part of the reserve in 2010, and it crept above the ravine where it was supposed to be confined, killed 3 seedlings just very easily. So we were worried about fire. There's also large patches of bracken fern, which is expanding, and it's affecting another important species in the reserve, Leucosperma gerardia, which another student, Kira Kutz, was looking at. Bracken expansion is probably at least partly due to fire protection. So here's a picture of Steve at it. These are the seedlings that we had. They really look great when we plant them in the ground. Then after the fencing helped so much, we suddenly saw these color varieties. And here's a picture of Richard Green, who has been looking after the protea for decades. He worked for Dwarf. And then we kind of forgot about the proteas. We kind of felt that with all the planting out, we've done a good job. So in 2020, Mervyn Lotter and his team in Mpumalanga Parks, they went there and they started counting the plants, and it got to a count of over 1,000 plants, 93% reproductive. Wow. Job done, eh? With thanks to Mervyn. But we had a control burn in 2021, and it was the burn was a cool burn, or at least supposedly, but I think the biomass had built up over these years, and there was quite a serious damage. Here you can see, we went there earlier this month. These little black patches are what remains of many of the proteas that have developed into adults that have flowered, produced cones, produced seeds, and these ones are all dead. Well, maybe not all dead. I thought they were all dead, but subsequently, Mervyn and them have had a look, and there is some life there, but quite a devastating thing to see. And so we had our field trip. Yep. Planted on a road verge in the reserve, and these were doing the best. Okay, internet unstable. Hope you can still hear me. So these ones were planted in 2010, and they look great. But on the other side of the road, they had burnt and died. So, okay, I'm running out of time and I've got lots of slides. But anyway, I'm going to press on a bit and then skip a few things. So here's some really good maps that were produced here by Mervyn Lotter. And this is now one that they went to the site and he counted the plants. They had a big team so they could really be more thorough. And there was 631 plants, which is not too bad. But most of them are juveniles. One of these juveniles could actually be seedlings. So we've gone from 900 adults to 100 adults, but hopefully these will carry on growing to adults. You can see the bush encroachment that occurred around the sides. We had to push over these trees so we could take this photo. This is certainly It's bushiness, more biomass, increased fire intensity, impacts of global and climate change. We also looked at the leucospermum at the site, and here's just some pictures of our research assistants who helped us, Anisha and Emily. And there's lots of alien invasives. This is the ravine fire. But anyway, we've got our work is cut out for us with the project. We still really need to make a plan with how to manage fire. And it's something that will need a lot of consideration. Over the years, we've looked at lots of aloe species. We've had lots of postgrad students. They've been really good students. They've all presented at SAAB, and they've all published. So that's enough said on aloes. We looked at a number of protected trees over the years as well. Marula, I'm not going to say a lot about it. Chantal Helm, she's also published a few papers, although there's lots of stuff still to work on. We also had an honours student working on that. And we looked at various aspects, fire, herbivory. Numbers have declined greatly in the central district of the Kruger National Park, elephants pushing over marulas, and so on. But we did quite nice work on the reproductive biology, and also the extraction of oils from the seeds of marulas by one of our students who was a Zimbabwean. His main study sites were in Zimbabwe, but he worked with phytotrade. Then Sarah Fenter, who has been working on the baobab, she got her PhD. We wrote lots of papers on baobabs up in the Venda or Limpopo River Valley. In some parts, particularly in Zim, the bark is stripped and there's extensive damage. But we looked at, or Sarah looked at flowering, fruiting, seedlings, planted out some saplings. We did various little experiments. She published lots of papers as well. This is a sort of landscape in Venda with the baobabs. Baobab reproduction and regeneration was interesting. And where are the young baobabs? We couldn't find them in Venda. We couldn't find them in Kruger. They're being eaten by herbivores. So this is perhaps one of the most challenging, interesting aspects of baobabs, the reproductive biology, and the differences between individual trees that are persistent producers, called females in some countries, and persistent poor producers, which are called males, even though they are all monoecious. So we had a student, Anna Chetty, who did an MSc and published a paper on this. We've got a new student, Timothy Hall, who's further working on it. We also had a student working on the long-term changes in baobab populations in Kruger. We're also writing some stuff from there. And we looked at Wildbergia in the past. Jenny Burt did some work in at MSc. Our recent student, we co-supervised with Glynis here, Kaylee van der Bosch, who did an excellent study in the reproductive biology. And we've also working on a paper there. And we've got a new student, semester, who's looking at distribution modeling. So we've worked on the instead of the bottom up, the top down on medicinal plants, Jenny Burter, Vivian Williams, Kathy Zerafis, names that you'll be familiar with. And I think a lot of this other text is about various programs like the Threatened Species Program. I was chairperson of the advisory board for a number of years. It was an excellent program. South Africa's Red List is a world-class piece of work. And we can just whiz through this. You'll be familiar with much of this, I would think. And then conservation beyond nature reserves, we're thinking about conservancies, biosphere reserves, and so on. Important, of course, it's important. Our student Kira Kutzer worked on one of the biosphere reserves, the Kruger Canyons, and did a PhD and developed these maps and persistence maps and so on, interesting stuff. And I was involved in the early stages of grassland program, and we'll just whiz through those slides. So South Africa often leads the way in conservation ideas and efforts. Developmental pressures increasingly an issue in Africa with negative conservation trade-offs. There is no doubt that global change is having severe impacts on threatened plant species through changes in climate, fire, dispersal, land use, fragmentation, etc. Yet innovative conservation efforts in Africa could yield major benefits, and we need to work and have conversations on more win-win solutions. And this whole thing about conversations came from when our VC introduced me, and instead of reading that I was a conservationist, said I was a conversationist. But in a way, in hindsight, he was probably right. We need these conversations, and the one we need now is to discuss fires in areas with plantation forestry. And I've got so many people to acknowledge, and if you don't get acknowledged, sorry, but it's many people are not listed here. I see Eugene is one of the people listening in. I should acknowledge you as well, Eugene. Thanks for all your help. Right, that brings me to the end of my talk, and thank you all for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. That was great. The floor is open for questions. So please add them in the chat box, or just raise your hand or unmute yourself, and please feel free to ask your question. I kept an eye on the chat box, but I didn't see anything particular. But I actually do have a question about those Euphorbia clavicola. I think one of the threats or the problems there is increasing fires. What's the causes of those fires, or what's changing the fire regime?
So thanks for that question, Anina. And it's obviously, you're asking it because I think I've explained it quite poorly. The two populations that we looked at, one was quite close to an urban area where there was lots of disturbance and there was annual fires, and the plant did really well. In a nature reserve where it's supposedly protected, they excluded fire because it suited this supposedly rare antelope. I mean, they're not that common. And so the fire regime was good for the sesame antelope, and it was very bad for the euphorbias. And when you looked at the landscape in winter, the euphorbia is one of the few green bits of vegetation, and there was a lot of herbivory. So you've got this massive contrast of an area near an urban center where there's a lot of disturbance and virtually annual fires, and all the plants there were doing quite well. I'm not saying they're still doing well there now because of the threat of housing, but yeah, more frequent fires are what we recommended, and they didn't take that advice. So the populations declined to extinction. So I hope that's a better explanation, Anina.
Yes, no, I mean, there's a lot of detail. You can't give the detail of all the projects. Tim, please go ahead with your question.
How's it, Ed?
Hey, good to see you, Tim.
Yes, and congratulations. It's wonderful to receive the recognition of the SAAB Silver Medal. I'm really pleased for you. It's great news. I want to ask a couple of questions. One quite easy, and then another maybe a little bit more challenging. The first is how you chose which species to work on. Was it sort of scouring the red data list and deciding what was most important, or was it just serendipitous and what you like to work on? And then secondly, I wonder if your work, you've had a parallel interest in sort of developing those traits which make species perhaps more vulnerable than others to extinction, whether you've thought about or have written sort of a synthesis of all of this work that you've been doing and bringing it all together in a sort of more theoretical level for conservation ecologists working on rare and threatened plants.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tim. And it's good to follow you with your silver medal last year. So I also enjoyed your presentation. But yeah, when I had the road trip through the northern provinces, and Wayne Boyd was he mentioned that there was a lot of effort on SciCat, so we avoided SciCat at that stage, even though, of course, SciCats became important later on when we actually started working on SciCats. But he said that very little work was done on euphobias. So I thought, yeah, let's give that a go. So I guess it was serendipitous, opportunistic, perhaps a bit ad hoc. And then he showed us quite a few proteas and the Haworthia. And it was also that I was taking on students, so we tried to look at the scale of the problem, so to speak, with the different students. Yes. Then your second question, yeah, now that's a good question. And that is something that I need to do still. You know, one's always thinking about traits. And I think with the euphorbias, I thought, and I gave a talk at SAAB a few years ago, and with the Threatened Species Program. In fact, many people at the Threatened Species Program at the time, it was at UCT, and they gave presentations, and I thought, I'll give a presentation of what we'd done in euphorbias at the time, seeing if we could synthesize this euphorbia information and come up with these traits as you mentioned. That was the idea. But it didn't kind of work out that way. They were so idiosyncratic. But you know, I mustn't give up on that, because I think I need to look at that. Now that we've studied a couple more, and Michelle Fabb has also studied a number of other euphorbia species that I wasn't involved with. So we really need to try to get together and try to look at that. So I think looking at traits within particular groups of plants, you know, families or succulents or something like that, will probably work better than being more universal. But I agree with you 100%. And even when I was preparing this talk, I thought, there's not enough synthesis of this sort of information, which could then help other people who are working in other groups of plants or conservation managers. What surprised me was the Delosperma, because there the traits were quite interesting, and this sort of weedy nature that caught me by surprise and was interesting. So they had a lot of common traits amongst the species, but still doesn't explain very well why some of them are so rare. It may just be habitat fragmentation, you know, towns being built up and so, you know, urbanization and so on too. So, but, you know, we can chat on this some more.
Thanks, Ed. Great.
Thank you so much. I see William Bond also has a question. Please go ahead.
Hello. Hello, Ed.
Hello, William.
How's it? And congratulations, man. That's
thanks so much.
I didn't manage to catch all your talk, but I was wondering when PVA was beginning, genetics was very much a major part of it. When you have small populations like you have, I would have thought that the problems are mostly to do with survival of existing individuals, in which genetics has a minor place because it's essentially ecological problems. And that genetics might only become important if you really do get populations expanding again. I was wondering if you had any comments on that, and whether you've seen any genetic impacts, for example, when you've tried to replant individuals from very small populations.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. And with the protea, we did try to look at the genetics. And in fact, Kevin Borkwell got an honors student, and with help from Herman and Michelle van der Bank, this young girl used some old techniques, isozymes and the AFLPs. It was quite a while ago, and they compared the protea in the reserve with some of the individuals that were planted in the foresters' garden as an ex situ effort. And they also compared it with the tree form of the protea. And they found that Hamiltonia had much lower genetic diversity than subspecies Rupellia, and also that the genetic diversity in the garden was lower than in the reserve. And we have tried to make further efforts to do genetics, but without success for various reasons. But it's something that's still in mind, and we've certainly got very good facilities here, and we've got good expertise at WITS. So I'll be calling on my colleagues to help me with that one. But it's interesting what you're saying about when you plant the plants out. Now, because we collected seeds from plants in the reserve, we've maintained good genetic diversity, I believe, but we've got to test that. What really worried me about the fire that occurred at the end of last year, I didn't realize until our recent visit that it had been so destructive. And so I asked my colleagues to collect the seeds that were about to disperse from those plants in the reserve at the moment, because they represent the genetic diversity of not only the plants that are still alive, but those that succumb to the fire. So we view those as very valuable genetic material, and we will be using those to grow more plants, to germinate and to grow more seedlings, because I really feel we need to get back up to 1,000 plants, because I'm worried about the common Dacre returning. They didn't return. I'm quite surprised that they haven't returned, and I'm worried that at some point they will return and start, and there could be this problem, we could just go into some sort of cycle. But yeah, no, very good question, William, thanks.
Thank you very much. Excellent. I see one more question in the chat box from Pilo, who asks, what's the conservation approach or advice to managers if in a reserve some species need fire to spread or to germinate while others can't stand fire?
Yeah, Impilo, you're asking me that tricky question, and that question is almost a microcosm of where we find ourselves at the protea site. It's surrounded by pines. Plantation industry in that region has suffered some quite bad fires a few years ago. They've lost a lot of trees. It's major financial loss for them. They're anxious to burn fire breaks, and I'm worried about the way it's done, because I think it's suboptimal for our proteas and for the indigenous flora. And it's something that we didn't really take care of in the past. We were so busy growing seedlings and planting them out and clearing aliens within the reserve. And then I knew we had to have a fire. I had protected the seedlings, and I didn't want a fire because I wanted those little seedlings that we planted to grow up. And of course, the biomass increased in the reserve. And so I'm at fault as much as anyone else could be at fault. When the fire, we had a management fire, I kind of felt it was too early, but we need to have these discussions, these conversations, as I said, and discuss this. So your question, I mean, that can certainly happen. And I think we need some of the fire experts to weigh in on that. I don't know the answer to that question, but I'd really like to discuss it. You can email me if you like. I'd be happy to discuss it further.
Thank you. So we're getting close to the end of our time. But there are two questions that we can quickly attend to. One from Natty Finkelstein that asks about Protea rupelliae. You mentioned that the rodents were a problem. Kindly elaborate, as I thought some of the prostrate growing proteas may be rodent pollinated.
Yeah, I think Jeremy Midgley and his students have, if I'm, I could be, I think he was the one, maybe it was Steve Johnson as well, have shown that. Yeah, these ones, we found, malachite sunbirds. Once they started flowering, the birds returned. I put out bird perches actually at one stage, and the sunbirds were pollinating. So that was another thing on the to-do list to look at that. But Steve Johnson has looked at Protea, and his team, I think it was Anna Hargreaves, looked at Protea repelii, the tree form. And so we expect to find a similar situation with our Protea. But when we first fenced and the plant started recovering, there was almost no damage at all to these plants. Everything was going really well. And the cones were producing lots of seeds. But then in time, I think the rodent numbers started building up, and there was a little bit of stripping of the bark and some of the plants. And we set some traps and caught it. It was amazing how destructive one single striped mouse was. Caught it, we removed it, we released it somewhere else. Our head of school works on striped mice, so didn't want to offend anyone. But the thing is that the levels of herbivory on the seeds and on the plants, it has increased over time, but it's still quite light compared to what it was. When I was at the population on Mother's Day, which was a few days ago, I noticed one plant where there was obvious mammal herbivory, otherwise none of the others showed any. Our fence has, bits of it has always got stolen over the years, and we had to fix it, and we gave up fixing it. The fence has pretty much collapsed over most of that little reserve, so we thought, right, the data can get in now, and but we're not having a big problem yet. So I don't know if that really answers your question well, Anina. It's a tricky one.
Thank you. And then last question by Gugu is about also the Protea. How do the cones survive fire since they're so close to the ground? They seem to grow quite fast. Is the time to reach reproductive age shorter than the fire interval that results in bush encroachment?
Yeah, no, good question, Gugu. Yeah. Well, you know, we never expected this sort of problem or this level of mortality with this fire. And I guess it's global climate change, but, you know, if you work in the fynbos, you know, the proteas are reseeders or resprouters. Reseeders, the adults die and they recover. The seeds are released and then seedlings grow off in the post-fire environment. And in fact, you can ask William, he's done a nice paper or two. They, you know, recommends autumn burns rather than spring burns, because then the seeds are on the ground for shorter periods of time, less likely to be eaten by rodents and other animals. So yeah, we were quite surprised when we planted these plants and they became reproductive. I mean, it's quite variable amongst individuals, but I think there was one plant that started flowering after 3 or 4 years and then producing cones. And yeah, quite good. Now, in terms of the cones, did they survive the fire? Well, by and large, where the plants that really experienced the fire, they got badly burnt and the cones got burnt, but they did release the seeds. So there were quite a few seeds released. And the plants that I showed you that were still alive were the ones that I had planted myself along this sort of old track, which we were trying to actually restore the track. And I thought, well, let's plant proteas and see if they help. And I'm very glad that I did plant them there. And so normally to answer your question, I would say yes, they were reaching reproductive maturity within the period that we were burning at the time, but I don't think our fire regime that we are burning there is optimal. And I think we really need to discuss this a lot more. And in fact, I've already started enlisting foresters and various people like Kurt Hildenhuis and Sally Archibald. We're going to be talking about plantation forestry and fires and that sort of thing in the near future. So good question, Gugu.
Excellent. It's great to hear that the work is going on and that you're going to keep on working on that. And yes, hopefully people that keep on carrying that work forward. Thank you so much for your time to present this webinar and taking the time to answer all the questions. We appreciate it so much. It's been really great. And thank you everybody who attended. Please look out for our second webinar or the next webinar, which will be on 22 June, also Wednesday. So we hope that you can all attend that as well. Thank you to Glynis and Shirk and Elizabeth all for helping with the organization. Glynis, I don't know if there's anything else that you want to say just to close off.
Anina, no, that's all. Thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks to Ed for a very interesting talk.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening.